are identified based on facts in Africa. So one of the things we did was to look at the warming in Africa. We know the global warming, but the idea was to focus on Africa and see what is the level and what is the rate of warming, taking African land masses as the focus. So 2010 appeared to be the warmest year in the record, with the level of 1.4 degrees C above the reference period chosen. That is between 0.7 and 0.8. And then the rate of warming computed since 1950 till now is about 2 degrees per century. But the past 25 years over Africa has a warming rate close to 4 degrees per century. So clear signals that were conveyed to the African Union Commission, and then at different events at COPs in Paris, where we had a lot of discussions on where Africa sits in this 1.5 degree global limit, given what we have now on the ground in terms of level and trends. Now, we also have in Africa an African Union program called PIDA. It's a plan for infrastructure development in Africa and a comprehensive agriculture development program for Africa. So all these programs would need climate resilient infrastructure on one hand for PIDA, and then update of the agricultural calendar in different regions in Africa on the other hand. So to support that, we analyze the Codex Africa datasets to come up with hazards, expected hazards that can be considered in the process as a way forward. The other item that was mentioned earlier is the idea of dialogue. So we recognizing the situation, because when we started discussing with African Union Commission, most of the products that were around before this project were considered irrelevant. And I was even told by the policy support officers there that when the forecast comes, it is put in the trash. So we went through a dialogue which helped to come up with something that they can at least consider. So we have a policy dialogue every year. It's just one day, putting together policymakers, particularly those from the Ministries of Economy and Finance, and then the African Union Commission together, and discuss the climate change with an African eye, highlighting issues that need to be highlighted, and putting the collaboration needed to move forward. So the second dialogue that we held last February ended up with the proposition to have us working with the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa to revise the guidance document that is used in the countries to draft strategic papers. For example, the country's economic growth strategy paper that is developed in African countries rely on a guideline provided by UNECA. So this guideline, the new version, would include elements that will effectively have to mainstream climate information into strategic planning at the national level. Yeah. So this is another example of a service, a real service in the sense that the Ministry of Health in Niger have to tackle meningitis epidemic regularly. So every week they have a meeting and request a situation in terms of vigilance level and districts that have the potential to generate meningitis. So this is provided within the meningitis belt first for all Africa, and then targeted over Niger. In the poster that you can see outside, it is targeted over districts in Niger. This helps to organize meningitis vaccine distribution. The last point that I wanted to mention is related to this process where early warning systems are considered actually essential in disaster risk reduction for preparation and early response. But we have different sets of the puzzles available, and the integration is still a problem. And one case that I have to show effectively the situation is in the poster. It's related to the drought in Southern Africa that occurred between October 2015 and March, April 2016. The SADC, which is the policy body in the region, declared officially the drought in July. And by September, October 2015, in the forecast, in the observations, the signals for a case for action was there. But what is happening in the practice, even though in the strategies for disaster risk reduction, preparation and early response you mentioned, in practice, we have usually Red Cross, local offices, who report after the events are impacting people, and you went through a process of workshops at the national level, which then recommend to the country to declare the state of emergency. And it is our practice until now, and one of the challenges I wanted to put forward is how do we move towards a situation where we change this practice, and it required a lot of culture and cultural science that is well beyond what we can provide. Thank you.
We'd like to thank Mr. Kanga for his presentation. As you may have seen, there were 29 posters we presented at lunchtime on Team 1. We asked our posters experts to prepare brief statements on their posters, which are all on the meeting website, and I hope that you have all had time to look at these alongside the posters as well. I also hope that you have come prepared with questions for our experts. I plan to invite a number of experts in turn to give really 2-3 short sentences on the key messages from their posters and statements in response to the themes and questions in the information note. I hope that these short interventions will help trigger a productive dialogue and further questions. As the experts are invited to speak, the Secretariat will put up the relevant posters on screen. We will carry on this Team 1 until 5 o'clock, then we will move on to Team 2. As we have heard from Mr. Kanga, I would like to invite 6 further experts from regional climate centers to tell us the key messages and gaps that need to be addressed in the region in regards to climate observation, research, and climate services. As we are running a little bit late, I would like to ask you to give 2-3 short sentences in the key messages from your regions. I would like to start with Mr. Gong from the Beijing Climate Center. Mr. Gong, you have the floor.
Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to say something about the climate activities and the services in Beijing Climate Center. As the National Climate Center of China and Regional Climate Center of WMO, it has the responsibility to monitor and diagnose global atmospheric and oceanic conditions. And it also has the responsibility to issue global climate prediction and impact assessment at different time scales and to provide the climate services to different users. And we have established the China framework of climate services and to provide service to different users. And it is related to the agriculture, disaster risk reduction, energy, and other issues. And we have learned how to transfer from climate to services by understanding the benefits of climate services, by making engagement with the users and providing tailored products and getting feedback from them. And we also have some challenges for the implementation of climate services. First is the observation and mechanism. Climate of East Asia is influenced by the Asian monsoon system. Therefore, under the global warming, some influence caused by the elements of the monsoon system has been changed. So we need to identify and confirm such kind of influence mechanisms by some studies. And also we have the poor observation for the third polar region. So another challenge we are facing is the prediction accuracy, because sometimes our users don't trust our products due to the uncertainty of climate prediction. Therefore, we need to develop our climate models, and we need to collect high-resolution model output from different centers to make the multimodal ensemble predictions. And at the same time, we are also trying to let the users understand the uncertainty of climate predictions. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Gong. Now I would like to call Mr. Juan Jose Nieto from the South American Regional Climate Center in 2-3 short sentences, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, in terms of the climate research gaps in Latin America that we identify are the quality of the databases, issues with that, the need to higher resolution model outputs, the understanding of the climate system and its dynamic response, mainly with the ENSO, the ENSO cycle and its relation with the climate change, and a better understanding on the ENSO impacts in different regions. And also in terms of communicating with the policymakers, a good understanding of climate, both in global and regional, and its local possible impacts is the first step to determine how vulnerable is the territory in those climate threats. And communication strategy can be identifying to inform and engage authorities and community leaders to overcome with political and communitarian responses, both at local and national levels. And finally, once the decision makers are involved and adaptation or resilience measures are defined, with the participation of the stakeholders, this can be implemented in the territory. Some lessons learned about El Niño have to be in terms of monitoring data and information provision issues in communication strategies at different levels, strengthening the institutional framework, the coordination of interagency, and the need to harmonize agendas of risk management and climate change. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nieto. Now I would like to call Mr. Stefan Rösner from Area 6 Regional Climate Center.
Thank you, Chair. I'm representing the WMO Area 6 Regional Climate Center network. The network is the first challenge because we have a distributed function. The mandate that has been given to us by the member countries in the region, the 50 member countries, through the national Met services, has been discharged by 3 network nodes, one dealing with provision of data sets, one with climate monitoring products, and the other in 2 locations dealing with seasonal forecast products. So as the region stretches from Greenland in the northwest to Jordan in the southeastern part, and well into the western part of Russian Federation, you can imagine that the challenges we are facing are huge. We have highly developed countries down to some developing countries in the region, and national Met services of various capabilities. So challenges related are with merging new data sources, filling data gaps, missing data. Data rescue is an issue in all countries. Homogeneity of data, uncertainty of estimations, new and improved climate monitoring products, attribution of trends, improved climate watch systems, which are early warnings of extreme events, further development of long-range forecasting, modeling, verification, interpretation of model results, downscaling, and impact forecasts, just to list a few. Yes, that ends my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rösner. Now I would like to call Mr. Atsuya Kinoshita from Tokyo Climate Center.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon, everyone. The Japan Meteorological Agency, Japan Meteorological Agency, JMA, has been making various efforts to assist Asia-Pacific countries, and here I would like to introduce the effort of its Tokyo Climate Center and the Meteorological Research Institute. The Tokyo Climate Center, TCC, serving as a regional climate center of the World Meteorological Organization in Asia, assists climate services of such as Asia-Pacific countries as a part of the regional cooperative activities. As one of such activities, TCC has organized annual one-week training seminar. In this seminar, participants can learn about the state of the art climatological technology, both in the classroom lecture and the practical exercises. Meanwhile, the Meteorological Research Institute, MRI, have conducted the international collaborated research with developing countries to produce the detailed structure with the future climate change projection in tropical and subtropical regions. Each country researchers learned how to use the non-hydrostatic regional climate model, which was developed by MRI and conducted to the future climate projection on their countries by using a supercomputer system. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Kinoshita. Then I would like to now call to Mr. Ulrich Trotz from the CCCC to give his presentation.
Yeah, the CCCC Climate Change Center providing services to 14 Caribbean countries. I'll just look at some of the problems basically in trying to do this type of work in a developing country context. And the big one is basically the paucity of data, both historical and current. And this latter one is exacerbated by lack of government support for meteorological departments. We must address our human resource problem. We are certainly very limited in this area, both for research and actually for meteorology. We find it very difficult to recruit into the meteorological field due partly to the teaching of physics and maths at the school level. It's in a pretty bad state. The other challenge, basically, which is unique to the region, but which we are fighting with, is we're trying to standardize our monitoring network across the region, but we find it is a big challenge due to the procurement restrictions required by our donors. And the other one, which is again might be peculiar to developing country context, is that data simulation technologies, along with the mode and speed of transmission, are advanced at such a rate that our internet service providers cannot accommodate these new technologies. So these are some of the restrictions that we face.
Thank you, Mr. Tross. Also, thank you to our presenters. Now I would like to open the floor for questions for about 10 minutes. And the questions can be raised to all our experts and also the keynote speakers. So please, colleagues, the floor is open. Switzerland, you have the floor after Germany.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, just coming back a little bit on the discussion, you invited us to introduce ourselves when we asked the question. My previous intervention on communication to the presenter was because I'm in the Swiss government, in the Swiss Federal Office for the Environment, fulfilling the function of the science policy interface. And I'm the focal point for the IPCC. I'm also the focal point for the IPBES, also for biodiversity. And you see where we are between the scientific assessment and the policy making. And just to close the parenthesis on this. On this global framework for climate services, which we contributed very much to establish in the third World Climate Conference, took place in Geneva in 2009. We have great expectations on that. And there was a very interesting poster outside also on the modeling and what we may get from modeling. Well, as you have indicated, from 3 months to 30 years or 100 years if possible. But I mean, and the discussion with the colleague presenting the poster showed that now for seasonal, for 2 years, for 5 years, we get more robust science and modeling and the prediction, and that we get a very robust situation where we can use for advising policymakers, of course, with the uncertainty and etc. But it's better to know something than nothing. So my question is how this situation, which is in development of modeling, of providing insights and so on, how the global framework for climate services is it integrating it really? Because we are at the border of research and implementation, and it's certainly not easy for, well, already seasonal, but 2 years, 5 years, to tell something to planners, to land planners, to agriculture, to health planners and managers and so on. How do you live with these being at the forefront of research that has to be integrated for implementation and decision making? Thank you very much.
Thank you for the question. I would like to gather a few questions and later on give the floor to the presenters. So now I'm calling to Germany.
Thank you, Chair. And also thank you to the presenters and the poster producers. It was very interesting to see all this wealth of climate information at the regional scale. And it almost seems as if there are no gaps, so rich is the information. So thank you. My question is on gender issues. The UNFCCC has recognized the importance of involving women and men equally, both in UNFCCC processes and in national climate policies that are gender responsive. And a dedicated agenda item has been established addressing gender and climate change, and overarching text has been included in the Paris Agreement. And I think gender aspects are also relevant for climate services. So my questions are you aware of gender-specific research in climate science, or are there gender-specific climate services? And then maybe also for Jim Ski, the next presenter, if the IPCC will address gender issues in its upcoming reports. Thank you.
So I would like to call now to Senegal.
Thank you. Thank you. I just want also to thanks Substack Chair for giving us this opportunity to discuss with under this research dialogue on this important matter for all our deliberation linked to adaptation and issue linked to globally to disaster risk management. I want to ask a question regarding how far is the collaboration between the different centers, because maybe there are some centers who are more well advanced than other centers. So how far is the collaboration? If I take the case of Africa, maybe there is some limited capacity due particularly for logistic, because we have lost less station for observation. So maybe do we try to find a way maybe to improve this logistic aspect, but it's really a key aspect for Africa through this collaboration. Another one is, another question is regarding your strategy with policy makers. I think sometimes research wording are a little bit too technical or too scientific for policy makers. So what are the strategy you are deploying actually in order really to make policy maker following your recommendation? I think this is critical where we are. Thank you.
Thank you for the questions, colleagues. I would like to turn now to our regional centers and ask them if they have a response to the question. So please, if you feel you can raise your flag and respond.
Ulrich Trotz from the Climate Change Center in the Caribbean. Just wanted to respond to the first question about the climate information, etc., and the time scales. I think you need to be aware of the different user groups and what is the time scale that they operate in. For farmers, for instance, the seasonal short-term forecasts are critical. And if you're looking at things like coastal protection, infrastructure, etc., then the longer-term forecasts basically are, or the projections are the types of information that is required. In the Caribbean, we have a climate center. The WMO Climate Center is CIMH, the Caribbean Institute of Meteorology and Hydrology, and they are basically focusing on the short and medium-term forecasts for a set of user groups. At the center, we are working with the Institute of Meteorology in Cuba and the Caribbean Climate Studies Group at the University of the West Indies, and we are doing the long-term projections. So between the two institutions, we are covering a range of needs and a range of stakeholders, but you need to identify the different stakeholder needs, etc., to understand basically the scale and the time frame in which you produce the information. While I have the floor, just a suggestion. I myself, going around some of the posters today, it was quite revealing about the range of work that is being carried on, different centers, different countries. I think it would be good if the Secretariat basically could look across the whole spectrum of work that's being done, look at best practice basically, and make this accessible. For instance, with us, the work that we've done was inspired by work done by UKSIP in the UK with the weather generator. But there are several examples of this type of thing where other countries could draw on the work done in other centers without setting up that collaborative effort. Let's have a platform for this type of exchange.
Okay, thank you for that, Mr. Trost. I would like to now turn to Mr. Carlson.
I like the question about gender. I think that's very important for our science. WCRP used its grand challenges as an opportunity to recruit and support new leadership. I can't say it was all a wild success, but if you looked at poster number 1 on extremes, you saw L. Alexander, you saw G. Harrigal, and S. Senavaratne. Those are Lisa, Gabby, and Sonia, and I take that as a positive, but the fact that we can call that out still as an exception rather than a rule suggests that we have much additional effort.
Thank you for that. Then I would like to now call Mr. Rapley to respond.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to respond to the question raised by the Swiss delegate on how do you deal with ongoing irreducible uncertainties, because this is a core issue. And I chair an organization called the London Climate Change Partnership, which essentially brings together all of the bodies that represent the metabolism of London to ensure that London is as climate robust as it can be. And one of the big issues that has been looked at by the Environment Agency, which is one of the members of the partnership, is the evolution of sea level rise, because we have to protect the London floodplain. It's got 200 billion pounds worth of real estate on it, 1.5 million people, 40 railway stations, 50 tube stations, and so on. So you can see that protecting the London floodplain is a big issue. But the bill, if one considers what is the worst that might happen over the next 100 years, could be as much as 20 billion pounds. So one wants to ensure that one doesn't unnecessarily spend money, but on the other hand, one wants to ensure that the obligation of maintaining London, the risk at the 1 in 1,000 level, is sustained. So the way this was addressed is an adaptive pathways approach. So the question was posed to the expert team looking at this: think of the different levels of response that would be necessary, going from a relatively mild level of sea level rise through a medium level to a high level. Have those plans in place, work backwards from the time that you would have to start implementing them should they become necessary. And then essentially move forward, understanding that situation and adopting the best possible choice of those different options at the key decision moments when they have to be made. And so not attempting to achieve the full protection of London over a projected 100 years now, but following how events actually unfold and responding to them. And that really is about the best you can do. But that has proved to be an extremely influential plan, and many other cities have seen it as a way of cutting the Gordian knot of irreducible scientific uncertainty. It's not just the irreducible uncertainty within the science, but of course it's the irreducible uncertainty of knowing how we all will respond to the science. So the trajectory of sea level rise depends on decisions that will be made collectively over the next 10 or 15 years. So that adaptive pathways is produced to be a very powerful way of addressing the problem.
Okay, thank you for that answer. I would like to now call Mr. Rössner.
Yes, I would shortly reply to the question of Swiss colleague whether GFCS does integrate and makes a difference. From my perspective, from a national perspective, certainly yes, because it triggers consideration how to make the provision of climate services an operational activity, and that needs governance and that needs resources. And I know from Switzerland and Germany, we do have implemented national climate services governance structures. And from these, they start to work with the national users who need the climate services. So GFCS does integrate. That is linked to the questions, how are the RCCs collaborating? In Europe, we do have a network, and in total, there are 10 Met services contributing. So we are coordinating amongst us, but there's certainly room for improvement to collaborate between the various regional climate centers in the different WMO regions. But as the RCCs are voluntary activities, there's room for improvement, but it needs also support. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rössner. Then I'm calling now Mr. Kamga to respond shortly.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, on the gender issue, this first pilot climate service for disaster risk reduction project we had in Africa has a steering committee, and the chairperson is a woman. And I can assure you that with her position, she really makes the difference. And it is something to continue to do in the future, actually. So on the GFCS and the different ranges of forecast, what one can say is just that the different users have different time scales of interest, and the predictability has to be factored in when we address those specific services. And there are frontiers, and there are quite a number of things that we cannot do now, but the potential is there that we can consider. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nieto. Really short, please.
Sure. I only want to thank the comment about gender, because it's a real gap that we have in the region. In the last project that we had, where the founder said that we have to include this into our project, we have to learn that it's more than include women's workshops. It's an issue that we have to deal with. So thanks to the comment.
Thank you. And lastly, Mr. Gong.
Thank you. Regarding to the collaboration among regional centers and the capacity developing issues, I would like to say by collaboration with the Beijing Climate Center, the training center of China Meteorological Administration has organized the GFCS training program for 3 years. During this training, we introduce what is climate services, how to do the marketing issues, how to make engagement with users, and to provide the services. And at the same time, we also shared some experiences and lessons learned from the implementation of climate services. And we also share climate prediction tools with the delegates from those less developing countries. And regarding to the uncertainty of climate prediction, I think it is a very general and common issue for all the climate, for all the other countries related to climate services. I would like to say in Beijing Climate Center, we do not provide the climate prediction product to the public directly due to the uncertainty of the climate prediction. But we have collaborations with the insurance company and let them to issue the climate risk indexes, and the public users and the companies could, based on their judgment, to decide whether to use this kind of risk products issued by the insurance company. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Thank you for the questions and also for the answers. Now we would like to delve a little bit further into what information and capacity building is available to support mitigation, adaptation, and NAPs. And I will invite now further experts in turn after each other. I would like to call on the experts to please identify 2-3 short sentences, the key message in their in your region. But please, since we are running late, please keep it short. First, I would like to call Mr. Morten Skovgaard Olsen from AMIP to please give a few short messages. Mr.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll try to be brief. I'm presenting the work of 100 scientists who have worked on an update of the snow, water, ice, and permafrost in the Arctic. Since 2011, what the assessment shows is that the warming of the Arctic continues, and so does the melting. In some instances, even at higher speeds. We will see a mid-century Arctic that will be very different from the Arctic of today, but substantial cuts in greenhouse gas emissions could stabilize impacts by the end of the century. So we're essentially saying that no matter what we do, we will have impacts. These changes in the Arctic will have major influences on energy fluxes and hydrological fluxes. So that raises questions that are relevant of adaptation, not only to the Arctic, but also to the global society, since the Arctic changes will have spillover effects to the Arctic. to the global society. So the questions that we pose are, what is the future role of the Arctic in the world climate system? Will the Arctic turn from a carbon sink to a source of greenhouse gases? This is not only related to permafrost, this is also related to the question about the role of the Arctic sea ice. What will happen when fresh or meltwater overlying the Arctic Ocean is released? We see a buildup of fresh water on top of the Arctic Ocean, which could potentially be released. How much will the Arctic ice caps, land-based ice, contribute to future sea level rise is another question that we put our finger at. And how will Arctic changes affect mid-latitude weather, something that Mr. Carlson already alluded to. So we find that adaptation in the region is certainly something that the nations of that area will have to address, but putting forward these additional questions are certainly something that we will need to address in a science context. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Olsen. Now I'm calling Mr. Hugo Zunker from the European Commission.
Thank you, Chair, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. So a couple of sentences. Copernicus is an operational program of the European Union and provides a number of services which deliver geophysical data, products, as well as information according to a wide range of user needs. In order to provide these services, Copernicus is operating a significant spaceborne observation capacity, which will expand further over the coming years, just like the full program. This is a research dialogue, so there are interactions between Copernicus and the research arena. So research activities, firstly, are needed continuously to feed into the services and to keep the products at the cutting edge of science. Secondly, the asset of deliverables from Copernicus program, which are quality controlled, are made available to any type of research activities at global, regional, or national level under a full, free, and open data policy. So everybody can get these data. The services are focused on Earth subsystems and in particular a climate change service which is providing climate data at global, regional scale, European scale. A sector information system builds on this data and provides value-added products by merging climate data with other sector-specific data such as infrastructure data, population data, economy data, and so on. Downstream services, which are normally outside of the program itself, can further enrich and downscale this information to meet specific and local needs. Our poster here shows some number of case studies of indicators to be applied in the adaptation planning for sectors of forestry, olives, or farming and wine cultures. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Zunker. Now I'm calling Mr. Thorsten Kiefer from the Future Earth.
Okay, thank you, Chair. I'm going to share with you research highlights from some global research projects that are operating on the Future Earth. And the one there on the left is a compilation that shows that air quality and climate change are inexorably linked from their emission source to their impacts on climate, on human health, and on ecosystems. In conclusion, then, is that considering jointly local air quality and global climate change can help to develop policies to the benefit of both these aspects. There on the right is a new regionalization scheme, which is based not on climate state parameters, but on dynamic climate change parameters. So this new scheme offers a scientific basis for countries and regions to develop adaptation and decision-making, especially then also for managing climate-related disaster or environmental risks. And then on the bottom of that poster, We remind you of what Dave Carlson already mentioned, the upcoming Cities and Climate Change Conference in 2018 to be held in Edmonton, Canada, co-sponsored by IPCC and arranged by Future Earth and other partners. Thank you.
Thank you for this really short presentation. I would like to call Mr. G. Werver from the Royal Netherlands Meteorological Institute.
Good afternoon. I just have a very short presentation of my poster. The poster describes the International Climate Assessment and Data Set, which combines observational data, station data mainly, user-oriented climate indices and tools to make regional climate assessments and to do a model validation and skill assessments of seasonal forecasts, for instance. It is the backbone of the several regional climate centers around the world, the RCCs that were mentioned previously. So for instance, in Europe, in Southeast Asia, and in South America. And on the bottom of the poster, there's a very short description of a proposal that we are working on for the Climate Risk and Early Warning Initiative, the CRUISE initiative, where we propose a twinning project for the development of RCCs in Europe and in Western Africa. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Now I would like to call Mr. Andreas Hirner from the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology.
Good evening. West Africa Science Service Center on Climate Change and Adapted Land Use, WASCA, has a mandate to tackle climate change issues and ultimately enhance the resilience of women and environmental systems across West Africa. This is achieved by strengthening the research infrastructure and capacity in West Africa and by pooling the expertise of 10 West African countries in partnership with Germany. Therefore, the main objective of WASCA is to provide one, hydroclimate observation network across 10 member countries of WASCA with data access to the national weather services of these countries on request. Currently, we have more than 50 automatic weather stations installed all over West Africa. Then the second objective is to provide data access to the multimodal ensemble of high spatial and temporal resolution climate simulations over West Africa until the end of the 21st century. We have data access to researchers, policymakers who are interested. The address is provided in the address of the web page is provided in the poster. We also provide land surface and land use data from remote sensing. Another objective is to bias correct Africa Codex climate data. And finally, ultimately, we provide capacity building and training workshops for scientists in West Africa. Thank you.
I would like to thank Ms. Christina Olesugunen. My apologies for the wrong name. Now I would like to invite Mr. Andrew Matthews from APM.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the opportunity. And following the comments made by colleagues from Senegal and also from the Caribbean, the appeal that I would like to make is about systematic observations and to the policymakers in the room about having the investment and a long-term investment, both in financial contributions, but also in the development of the human capability to carry out observations and have them people trained to work on data recovery and also issues of digitization. These are real, and there is an ongoing need, but we have the pressure to reduce costs, and the pressure means then to reduce the number of measuring sites, even though we want to go to smaller scale observations and predictions, and those two things therefore don't go together. There is also, of course, a call in some of the policy circles that actually the information is already available on the internet. We would like to challenge that, or that you can just Google it. And so in this slide, I put the policymakers at the top of the food chain, if you like, the sound and enduring policy development. What we need at the bottom of the pyramid is well-calibrated climate observations, which indeed underpin the authoritative information that together builds a collective truth. And from that, we generate the knowledge that does inform that sound and enduring policy development. And so my take-home message would be, would you contemplate a journey with no fuel gauge? And so here, well, you cannot manage what you do not measure. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. Now I would like to call Mr. Apurka from IAA.
Thank you, Chair. The INI and IMARPE, Instituto del Mar del Perú, present the impact of 2015-2017 El Niño on the regional ocean variability of Peru. Those international coordination and cooperation scientists, educators, and students from Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Peru, Uruguay, United States, and even the sea lion are working together to provide tools to understand ocean variability. This tool will allow them to better map the relationship between the physical and biological variability, from primary production to fisheries in the Humboldt large marine ecosystem after 2015-2017 El Niño impacts. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Purka. Now I would like to call as a last speaker for this session, Stuart Goldstraw from our UK Met Office, please.
Okay, thank you very much. This is very much the elevator pitch as requested. The importance of long-term observational records providing underpinning evidence is well understood, and the locations that have made measurements for over 100 years are a valuable resource. Sustaining these observing stations into the future is an important challenge for our community. Otherwise, data gaps may actually grow rather than close. To help with this challenge and secure these observing stations into the future, a mechanism for recognizing long-term observing stations has been developed by WMO experts and importantly approved by WMO Congress. This is known as the WMO Long-Term Observing Stations Mechanism, or maybe some people may know it as a Centennial Stations Mechanism. This is the start of the journey to sustain this valuable observational resource, and we are taking this opportunity to raise the profile of this activity and encourage wider engagement in supporting the recognition mechanism and the subsequent preservation of these long-term observing stations into the future. Thank you.
Thank you, colleagues. That concludes our presentations. And now I open the floor for any questions. You can ask questions to all our presenters. The floor is open. Okay, if there are no questions, then we can move forward to the next presentations. Then several experts are focusing on regional modeling and downscaling. I now invite 4 of our experts to speak about the models and downscaling that is available for regional and national scale climate scenarios. I would call you please identify in two, three sentences the key messages from your work. First, I would like to start with Mr. Koji Dairaku from Japan. Mr. Dairaku, do you have the floor?
Okay. Thank you, Chairman. I'm Koji Dairaku from Japan. I'm taking a lead of the Codex ESG, Asia Codex ESG activity. So to meet with the needs of stakeholders such as local government in Asia, we developed the Codex Asia Empirical Statistical Downscaling Group in last year. Codex Asia ESG Group is mainly for enhancing and integrating the science and application for downscaling activity in Asia.
So we have 4 main activities and goals about this group. So first, to produce regional climate statistical downscaling information based on common protocols for providing the common benchmark for investigating uncertainty of regional climate scenarios. So secondly, we'd like to provide a case study in small domain for developing and improving the method where sufficient observation is available and for obtaining the best good practices for co-production and coordination with the Working Group 2 community. Third, we'd like to provide and improve the reference data and observational data for improving the method downscaling skills by collecting better observational data and its update. So finally, we'd like to provide a training workshop to share and exchange the knowledge and techniques. Anyway, so we'd like to enhance well-coordinated downscaling activity in Asia to provide regional climate information and service, which is required for risk assessment on sub-national scale for climate change adaptation and IPCC 6. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Director. Now I would like to call Mr. Hans-Jürgen Panitz from Karlsruhe Institute of Technology.
Thank you. Actually, I have 4 key messages from the poster and further work done by members of the CLM community within the framework of Codex Africa. The first one is that on the regional, or the continental and regional scale, regional climate models like Cosmos CLM, the model that we are using, are better suited to assess climatology and especially extremes and climate indices than the global models do. Extremes and climate indices like the number of consecutive wet and dry days, frequency and mean intensity of heavy rain events, for example. The second statement, due to this capability of the regional climate models, they can help to identify most vulnerable regions for more focused and better informed planning and adaptation and mitigation measures under climate change conditions. Thirdly, the models can provide a very high resolution, and with very high resolution, I mean grid spacing the lower than 10 or even 5 kilometers, and physically consistent data needed by impact models like hydrological and crop models, which need spatially and temporally highly resolved data as input data that goes beyond the standard variables like near surface temperature and precipitation. And the last statement, the assessment of the robustness of results still needs a multi-model ensemble approach and more long-term and reliable observations for model evaluation and improvement. The results shown on the poster are from a single RCM and must not be considered as significant and likely. Results from different RCMs might be, and they are, contradictory even if they are based on the same forcing GCM. Therefore, a multi-RCM, multi-GCM ensemble-based analysis is stringent and in order to assess the uncertainty and reliability of the model results. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I would like to call Mr. Jakob Scherer from the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact and Research.
Thank you. We're also dealing with the multimodal ensembles, in our case with impact models. So different from climate models, we're looking at processes like water, the water cycle and what it means for water resources. We're looking at agriculture, natural ecosystems, fisheries, health and other sectors that are influenced by climate and provide important resources to people. That's what we look at in the ECMIP project, and the poster. Oh, this is actually my second poster, so okay, let's talk about that one first. This is an example of research from that project. This one's about water resources and changes in natural surface water availability from an ensemble of regional hydrological models. It's come out from quite a large international modeling initiative, 11 modeling groups as part of ICIMIP. And for each of these basins shown there in the map, so these are 12 large river basins around the world, we now have an archive with multimodal ensemble simulations which facilitate regional scale research into future risks to water resources in these regions. And all these simulations are available publicly. So I think that's a nice resource for further research and use. And that leads into the second poster. I don't know if you can show that other poster also on the screen. That poster introduces the next phase of ICIMIP, which is a project called ECpedia, the Climate Impacts Encyclopedia. And the idea here is to build on that large archive of climate impact simulations and make them, evaluate them and make that information more accessible, not only for scientific users, but also for other user groups like planners and practitioners in particular countries and regions. The idea is to develop an online platform that offers guided access to the scientific model data, as well as region-specific assessments of the climate impacts in all these sectors and an assessment of the data quality. We explicitly, so the project starts in September, and we explicitly want to involve stakeholders from the beginning in the design of the impact indicators that will be presented on that platform, as well as in the selection of the topics that the ICIMIP modeling should focus on next. So if there are any comments or ideas from this group here, that would be already a welcome input for the start of the project. Thank you.
Thank you. Then I would like to call Mr. Ralf Döscher from the Swedish Metallurgical and Hydrological Institute. Mr. Döscher, you have the floor, please.
Thank you. I talk about the role of regional climate models for climate information and for climate services in the future. The global picture of future climate change comes from global climate models, but the information needs for adaptation is very much local, and the consequences of global mitigation can be local as well. Therefore, consequentially, high-resolution regional climate models need to be developed, used, and which incorporate local conditions for climate. And this is done by the Codex community, and the information is provided. A new challenge is now taking the next step and going to the kilometer scale, which is so-called convection permitting, which allows us to provide, for example, much better precipitation patterns, especially much better precipitation extremes. And finally, downscaling with high resolution and very high resolution regional climate models will be the primary source for climate services and climate information on regional and local scale in the next decades to come.
Thank you for our presenters. Now I would like to invite Mr. Adolfo Barbosa, member of the Least Developed Country Expert Group, to give some brief reflections on regional science needs and gaps and capacity building requirements in regards to the NEPs. Mr. Barbosa, you have the floor, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for inviting us to share some views related to science and policy-making process related to NEPs. The Least Developed Countries Expert Group has already produced guidelines for NEP formulation and NEP implementation. So we have covering issue of climate change analysis for the past, current, and future climate change analysis in order to provide more accurate data to support the National Adaptation Plan. So in this regard, this dialogue is very important for supporting the NAP process. We invited, under our work program for 2017-2018, we invited regional organizations to be taking part of NAP Expo, even though this year we postponed the NAP Expo, but NAP Expo will be done by next year. And we are going to have a NAP regional NAP Expo that will be enabling engagement of regional organizations like experts, like the regional centers and regional policymakers to take part in the process. So in this way, we can make a linkage between scientific people and decision makers toward climate change adaptation issues. And we are also going to strengthen our cooperation with regional international organizations, including WMO, to deal with climate data and having accredited entity for the implementation of GCF. We are also engaging this institution to deal with the accessing to the Green Climate Fund. One of the critical proposals made by the Pacific Island, I think there are 5 Pacific Island developing countries who are putting proposal together to deal with early warning system that is being implemented by WMO. So in this case, we can link scientific as well as policy making process, and we engage scientific institutions to take part of making or helping decision makers to start with national planning based on the related climate data. So I think this is useful, and we are also going to have regional NAP workshops in the future. One of the regional NAP workshops, NAP Expo, will be undertaken in Africa. I think it will be in Uganda in June this year. So African regional centers who are in this room will be engaged to take part. And we will expand this regional NAP workshop for Asia and also for Latin American Caribbean later on. So in this engagement, we can link scientific community and decision-making people. So with that wording, I would like to thank you.
And I would like to thank Mr. Barbosa and also open the floor for any questions to the recent presenters. So colleagues, if you have any questions, the floor is open. Luxembourg, your floor, please.
Thank you for giving me the floor, and first of all, thanks to the chair for convening this research dialogue. I think it was very interesting to have this exchange, and thank you for all the presenters who have presented today and also the poster presenters. Actually, I was trying to link actually 2 posters here. So we heard from the presenter from KIT that we should be careful with using information from one single regional model, that we should have ideally multi-GCM, multi-RCMs model ensembles. On the other side, another point for regional downscaling is this convection permitting scale. And actually my question there was, at codex level, there was at some point the idea to actually coordinate on this on this scale, and I wanted to know if this is still ongoing and what would be the status of this coordination. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your question. Would any other party would like to take the floor? If not, then I would like to turn to our presenters. If any of you would like to answer the questions, then please. Please go ahead.
Barnitz from KIT. Andrew, I guess you're not only talking about Codex Africa, but in general, convection permitting simulation. So I know, because I'm involved, there is a flagship pilot study has been started in the beginning of this year on convection permitting simulations for Europe within the Codex Phase 2 frame. So it's ongoing. It is in the very early stage. There have been 2 meetings, and the participants are just preparing test cases. And we hope that we will have first results that can be presented during the HIMEX conference in Barcelona. I think it's in the end of June, beginning of July. I'm not quite sure. And the second one is really related to Africa, but it is a proposal, still a proposal. There is a proposal on also as a flagship pilot study within Codex 2 for a convection permitting study for Eastern Africa, especially the Lake Victoria Basin area. It's still a proposal which there is no decision. It's led by Nicole van Lipzig and by Andreas Fink from our institute. So that's my knowledge.
Thank you for the answer. With that, we would like to move now to part 2, which focuses on scientific aspects relating to taking stock and assessing progress on mitigation. Mr. Jimsky will open the discussion with a presentation on mitigation pathways and sustainability in the context of the Paris Agreement. I would like to now invite Mr. Ski to make your presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Chair. And just to say, this presentation is on behalf of myself and my fellow Working Group 3 co-chair, Professor Shukla from the Indian Institute of Management. And just to remind that IPCC does not carry out research, it assesses the literature. And as the last assessment report was in 2014, I'm actually going to look forward in this presentation and think about what IPCC Working Group 3 will be doing in the 6th assessment cycle, and also focus on the possible contributions to UNFCCC, and in particular to the global stocktake. Oh, so I'm missing a slide. Okay, just to say, I did have a couple of slides that have disappeared for the moment. One of which was showing a picture of the 200 scientists who got together at the UN Economic Commission for Africa in Addis Ababa last week to scope out the 6th assessment report. And this was a very productive meeting involving lots of collaboration between the working groups. The other thing I wanted to flag up, that this was preceded in the previous week by a Working Group 3 expert meeting on mitigation, sustainability and climate stabilization scenarios, which was an extremely useful expert meeting that actually shaped some of the conclusions of the scoping meeting. And in particular, it was intended to address some of the feedback that we'd had on the use of scenarios, especially in AR5, relating to questions of feasibility of the scenarios, wider sustainability implications, and the transparency of the modelling and scenario approaches. And some very productive outputs came out of that meeting that will help us in AR6. But basically on this, I've only got 3 or 4 slides to show you. At the meeting last week, we had a number of breakout groups that cut across the different working groups of IPCC, and in particular, there was a specific breakout group held on the global stocktake and IPCC's possible contribution. This was co-facilitated by myself, Christiane Texter from Germany, who was nominated by Working Group 2, and Greg Flato, one of the vice chairs of Working Group 1. And I have to say, for this slide, I am relying greatly on Christiane's notes of the meeting, for which I am extremely grateful. So it covered the 3 themes of the global stocktake on mitigation, adaptation, and finance and support, I haven't got adaptation on that slide because it wasn't the subject of this meeting, but just to say it was a very short and focused discussion that concentrated on metrics and risks and costs at different levels of warming. On the mitigation side, it concluded that in the 6th assessment cycle, IPCC could provide insight into temperature and emission pathways based on working groups 1 and 3, on peaking and balancing of sources and sinks, primarily based on working group 3's work. It could provide information on available carbon budgets depending on levels of climate sensitivity, which would come from Working Group 1. And it could provide a range of insights on mitigation options, effectiveness, and their sustainability, perhaps drawing to a much greater extent on case studies for Working Group 3 than has been the situation in the past. And it could also look at options for decarbonisation in different sectors and the effectiveness of support for technology development and dissemination. The theme of finance and support was also covered. I have to say this was an area in which we found it harder to find perhaps literature of a scientific nature that could help the framework convention, but there were some views that we could actually perhaps help with more conceptual issues around development, definitions of adaptation, and some of the concepts in the literature, so more methodological elements. So I think there was a very positive message coming out of that, that IPCC absolutely could provide contributions in relation to the global stocktake. Now, the second main slide I have is a rather detailed one, which contains the proposed outline of the Working Group 3 report in AR6. And I'll spend a little time on this one to explain the architecture of the report and also the points at which contributions could be made to UNFCCC and the stocktake. And just to emphasize, this is not necessarily what the Working Group 3 report will look like. This was the proposal that came out of the scientific scoping meeting. It's going to the IPCC plenary in September, and countries may choose to do something different with it and adjust the outline. So just to emphasize, this is a proposal. This is not the actual outline. Now, I'm not intending to go through all the chapters one by one. You will be pleased to hear. I just want to make a few points. First of all, that sectors remain the core of the Working Group 3 report. I know some of the other working groups, you also emphasize regional aspects. For Working Group 3, sectors are basically the skeleton. And the reason for that is that it helps us to map on to the emission inventories as reported to UNFCCC by countries. So that's a fairly logical approach for doing it, which got a lot of endorsement from the focal points in the meeting. There are two what we called monster sectors, energy systems and AFLU, which may be rather large, but we also have one that we're calling urban systems and other settlements, which responds to the request of countries to pay greater attention to cities in the 6th assessment cycle. And that urban systems chapter would frame more detailed technical chapters on buildings and transport. One other aspect, we have a chapter before we really get into the sectors called Demand, Services and Social Aspects of Transformation, which is really to set up the way in which the sectors might help to meet human needs, and also provides a link into the Sustainable Development Goals. I think this is quite a tricky chapter, which we talked about a lot at the meeting, but it could usefully set up the framework for the sectoral chapters. Now, specifically on sustainable development, many people in the meeting made the point that sustainable development is wider than the Sustainable Development Goals themselves. And many people from individual countries and the national focal points who were present at the meeting emphasized that individual countries' development plans might contain elements that weren't completely covered by the SDGs or emphasized different elements. But we do intend to make the sustainable development and the Sustainable Development Goals effectively the bookends for the report. The first chapter is on introduction and framing, and we want to emphasize that the literature we are going to assess actually frames climate mitigation in different ways, and we want to capture these multiple framings in that introductory chapter rather than settle on one framing for the entire report. But nevertheless, one of the most important framings will be around sustainable development and the Sustainable Development Goals. And we will finish with a chapter going right to the end on chapter 17, which is essentially a synthesis chapter that tries to draw together the structure of the report in terms of a number of very important themes. There's about 5 in all, but the 2 most important ones are sustainable development and also some of the regional aspects, regional themes. So just to flag up that the sustainable development and the Sustainable Development Goals are very critical to the Working Group 3 report. Now, I wanted also to pick out on chapters 2 to 4, which are particularly important in terms of links to the global stocktake. Chapter 2, they're all based on a bird's eye view and time slices, and chapter 2 is retrospective. It's looking at drivers and trends, looking backwards and current developments. But for the future, we've actually divided it into 2 different chapters, responding very strongly to comments from governments and business at the expert meeting that we had. So chapter 3 is on long-term mitigation goals and pathways. It's one which really corresponds to the other chapter previously in AR5, which has a 2100 timeline and responds and will rely heavily on integrated assessment models. But we have had a strong request to look in much more detail at near and medium-term aspects, drawing on a wider range of modelling and scenarios literature, which would allow us to look in more detail at the collective impact of the NDCs, emissions peaking that you might expect to take place in that time scale, and the mid-century long-term low greenhouse gas emission development strategies that countries will submit. So we're really trying to break this into 2 different timescales. An important part of the narrative would be that the long-term emission goals and pathways will tell us what is required in the short to medium term if you're going to keep the option open of meeting the long-term temperature aspirations. And then the detailed chapter 4 will go into what the NDCs add up to and what might need to be achieved. And we also do have a couple of chapters on mobilizing financial flows and innovation, technology development and technology transfer, which again are going to elements of the Paris Agreement. My almost final slide, but there was also a big breakout group on possible elements of the synthesis report for AR6, and these were the 5 possible themes that were identified. So the global stocktake there was number 1, a very clear signal. Interaction among emissions, climate risks and development pathways, economic and social costs and benefits of mitigation and adaptation, adaptation and mitigation in the context of sustainable development, and finance and means of support. Now, I bounced this presentation off Florian Fladu from UNFCCC before I actually prepared it. He did say kind of, please produce some graphs and things that look like numbers as well as all these words that you have in there. So just to flag up, I mean, that there are ways in which it is possible to organize information to address the different elements of the global stocktake potentially. So the left one is the classic diagram from the UNEP GAP report, which kind of benchmarks the NDCs against least cost emission pathways. And I should flag up here that under AR6, we are establishing new databases for these scenarios. There will be a 1.5 database which we put together, which will develop will allow new pathways to be assessed. And that is through an agreement between the Working Group 3 co-chairs, the Integrated Assessment Modelling Consortium, and EASA, which will host the database. And after the 1.5 report is done, that same database will then be expanded to become the AR6 database with a wider range of scenarios in it. So we're thinking ahead of that. The agreement also provides, potentially, I should say, for some of that information to be provided early to the UNFCCC to help with the facilitative dialogue in 2018. But that does depend on permission coming from the authors of individual scenarios. And on the right-hand side, we have a couple of diagrams which are actually taken from the presentation I did here a year ago, which shows, for example, the issue of balancing sources and sinks, and just how much sink is needed to actually achieve your sort of net zero emissions in the second half of the 21st century. But other scenarios could be interpreted on that way. And at the bottom right, the question of peaking and kind of making the point. This is taken from 12 countries whose emissions have peaked in the last decade or so. And it's just to say that just because emissions dip for a few years doesn't mean they have peaked. They can continue to go up again, and we need to take a slightly longer term view if we're going to understand when peaking has occurred. So I just really wanted to go through that quite quickly and emphasize that, you know, that Working Group 3 certainly thinks that it has contributions it can make to UNFCCC and the global stocktake. I'm not quite sure we understand exactly the question we are supposed to answer, but these are some of the answers of the type that we could provide if we were to be asked. So let's keep the dialogue going.
Thank you, Jim, for your presentation. And let me apologize to the dialogue. I was called away to deal with some other issues, but I'm happy to report to you that I met with the Bureau and I was able to inform them about my dialogue I had with the research community this morning, and passed on the message that you've clearly provided to us. And so the Bureau is now aware of the concerns of the scientific community with the UNFCCC, and so they are now appraised, and in fact continue to await the inputs from the scientific community in this regard. And I'd like to thank Tibor, my vice chair, who ably conducted the dialogue in my absence. So 15 posters were presented at lunchtime on theme 2. Some of the issues have been covered by Mr. Carlson and Mr. Scarce. For this theme, I would like to invite delegates' permission to invite all the 11 experts that provided posters to expand on the presentation by Jim and provide 2 to 3 short sentences on key messages from their posters and statements, responding to the questions in the information note. Then we'll open the floor for dialogue. Presenters, please identify in 2-3 sentences the key messages from your work. First, I'd like to invite Glenn Peters from Cicero.
Thank you and welcome, Mr. Chairman. So in this poster, I talk about a method we developed to track recent trends in emissions, to track progress of the NDCs towards 2030 and the progress towards the Paris goals and raising ambition. So to put it in terms of questions, we can sort of answer things like, why have global emissions growth slowed down in the last 3 years, and how do you verify that? Where are emissions likely to go in the next 5 years, and is this consistent with the NDCs? And what is needed to raise ambition to meet the longer term objectives? We used a nested structure to allow a simple analysis at the first level initially, and then you can sort of zoom in and do more complex and detailed analysis at deeper levels, depending on the needs of the particular country and NDC and so on. And we based the analysis on national data, which is primarily reported to bodies such as the UNFCCC for emissions data, UN for things like economic data, IEA for energy data, and so on. Although overall it would be preferable if all the data that was used in the NDCs, such as economic data for emission intensity targets, was included in emission inventories to allow consistency and to make sure we use the correct data.
Thank you, Mr. Peters. I now invite Rosa Maria Roman Cuesta from C4.
Good afternoon. Yes, for those who have seen this poster, this will be a summary. For those who have not seen this poster, this is an invitation to pass by and get some further hints of what we've done. So this research, it's a collaborative work with CGR institutions, plus some universities like University of Wageningen. And it's an example of how to use independent data sets on emissions for identifying and quantifying emission hotspots and uncertainties for the land use sector. So my statements are quite generic and basically relate to the use of these independent emission data sets as a way to support UNFCCC processes, and particularly reporting processes on stock-taking support. The fact is that the scientific community is providing a wealth of independent, peer-reviewed, freely available data sets covering sectorial emissions. In the case of this case study, these emissions related to the land use sector, in particular croplands, rice, deforestation, fire, harvesting, livestock, etc. These data sets are unfortunately underused, and they are very useful because they provide high-resolution data, updated estimates on emissions, and they're frequently done through modeling approaches, which would correspond to Tier 3, which is an improvement from what countries frequently report, which is basic Tier 1. And some of these modeling approaches rely and use the guidance of the IPCC, in particular in this case was the guidance for the AFOLU sector. So the estimates provided through these independent emission data sets are in a way comparable to what countries report. And if countries' reported numbers are very different to what the scientific estimates suggest, then the confidence in assessing progress towards the Paris Agreement goals will be undermined. So what we suggest? We suggest and we encourage countries to assess the propriety of these existing data sets for their needs, to adjust these data sets if they are required, and to use them for three purposes. For complementing their national greenhouse gas inventories, particularly in countries that have issues of data gaps, have issues about uncertainties and comparability of their data and comprehensiveness of the data. The second proposal for countries to use these data sets is to help them navigate national and subnational mitigation action. And also, the third point is to help establish benchmarks against which countries can assess their current and future mitigation performances. And examples of these are in the poster. So if anyone is interested, we can share further information. And as the final statement, we would also like to encourage the UNFCCC to use these independent data sets and emissions to assess the propriety for their purposes, but also to use them on their existing independent processes of international assessments and reviews, and in the international consultation analysis as a way to contrast country estimates and the reasons behind the difference between independent emission estimates and country reports. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Cuesta. I'd now like to invite Richard Miller from the University of Exeter and Environment Change Institute, University of Oxford. Mr. Miller, you have the floor.
Thank you. So a key indicator for the global stocktake will be the observed level of human-induced warming in the climate system. This currently stands about 1 degree Celsius above pre-industrial and can be accurately calculated using simple climate modeling tools almost in real time. This index can provide a reliable measure of the current human influence on the climate system and a useful measure of change to the UNFCCC process in between the 7-yearly IPCC assessment reports. Tracking the evolution of this index can also help inform the required level of future mitigation ambition needed to limit warming to the Paris Agreement's long-term goals, including, but not necessarily limited to, assessments of the remaining carbon budget from that point onwards. We need mitigation ratcheting to be an adaptive process and not based purely on static historical estimates of what might be necessary to stay below a given temperature threshold with a particular probability. At a very global level, emissions must fall on average by 10% of their current level for every additional 0.1 degrees Celsius increase in the human-induced warming in order to reach net zero by the time human-induced warming reaches 2 degrees. For a 1.5 degree goal, emissions must fall by 20% to net zero to achieve that warming. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. We now have Thurston Kiefer from Future Earth.
Thank you, Chair. So in this poster, again, this highlights results from global research projects in future Earth. On the right, if you look for a true pre-industrial baseline, you have to look before the 1830s. That's the results from natural and historical evidence, because this is when human-induced climate warming already commenced in parts of the world, responding rapidly to even the relatively small increases in greenhouse gas levels during the early parts of the Industrial Revolution. So one of the implications is that climate is really highly sensitive to greenhouse gas forcing, with all the implications for mitigating or not mitigating. On the left, results from the Global Carbon Project, the Global Carbon Budget. In terms of carbon dioxide, we know that carbon dioxide emissions are almost flat since 3 years, even in the light of significant economic growth in parts of the globe. On the other hand, if you look at methane, the story is different. Atmospheric methane concentrations are rising faster than at any time during the past 2 decades, and that indicates that methane emission reduction also need our attention and have a lot of potential for climate mitigation. And at the bottom there's research in the effect of agriculture on emissions, and with the conclusion that to achieve even the 2-degree target, agriculture must reduce emissions of nitrous oxide and methane by 1 gigaton CO2 equivalent by 2030. Problem is that the technology to do that is not quite there yet. So that is a sector of urgent research. Thank you.
I'd now like to invite Henry Weissman from IDRI for his presentation.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the invitation. So I'd like here to present some insights from the Deep Decarbonization Pathways Project, which is a research initiative coordinated by IDRI in Paris with 16 country research teams all around the world. This project actualizes the process of designing national long-term low-emission development pathways in line with the invitation to parties in Article 4.19 of the Paris Agreement. And this project, to some extent, gives a proof of concept for key domestic benefits that can be expected from doing this exercise. You can find all the details on our website, which is at the bottom of our poster, but I will here focus on only 2 main messages. One, which is related to indicators. The lesson learned is that adopting common indicators to report emission drivers and socioeconomic dimensions in a transparent, sectorally detailed, and comparable way across countries is a triple win. Because it enables knowledge sharing across countries, because it informs domestic implementation by helping to identify tangible actions supporting the pathways, and because the additivity of the indicators can also support collective assessments of cooperation need as revealed by the requirements of domestic transformation. A second message is that adopting a backcasting approach based on collective benchmark characterizing the required long-term transformation in the common indicators proves a useful way to identify the short-term action putting on the right track for long-term ambition. So in the future, the DDPP will continue to support the analysis of long-term pathways along the above lines through its engagement in the 2050 Pathways platform directed by Laurence Tubiana, and also by building collaboration with new country partners beyond the G20 countries covered so far, in order to share the lessons learned with those needing methodological and technical support, notably in developing countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would now like to invite Mr. Joeri Rogelj from IASA for his presentation.
Okay. So this poster presents work from a consortium of 6 international modeling teams. Understanding progress towards the long-term goal of the Paris Agreement requires benchmarks, and benchmarks that can be compared to the emissions reductions achieved and proposed under the NDCs. Scientists have explored extensively the transition pathways limiting warming to below 2 degrees, but the same cannot be said for 1.5. Therefore, an international consortium of 6 global modeling teams has developed a new set of scenarios that limit radiative forcing to 1.9 watt per square meter in 2100. These scenarios keep warming in 2100 below 1.5 with roughly 66% probability, while that level is exceeded during the 21st century. These new scenarios provide a wealth of information which will be made available online as soon as these results are through peer review. For example, they provide sectorial details on how a transition to a 1.5 degree world can look like. They also show trade-offs, higher emissions in 2030, the time frame of the INDCs, come with a temperature penalty over the 21st century, and also the timing of achieving global zero emissions is earlier in scenarios if emissions in 2030 are higher. Finally, one of those scenarios will be selected and forwarded to CIMIP6 to be analyzed by state-of-the-art Earth system models that can provide climate and impact information for the IPCC 6th assessment report. And then,
thank you very much. Oh, yes.
So that was a poster on a modeling consortium. This is a new research from EASA. So one of the key questions of the global stocktake is, what are emission levels implied by the NDCs in 2030? So in this new study, we use a global integrated assessment model framework to look at the ambiguity in NDC targets and to see how it translates in a potential range of emissions. And we find a range of 47 to 63 gigatons of CO2 equivalent. This is more or less minus 10 to plus 20% around our medium estimate of 52 gigatons in 2030. This means that global emissions in 2030 can be higher, equal, or lower than today's level, while at the same time perfectly complying with the NDCs. So this begs the questions. But the question, what drives this uncertainty range, and can we do something to reduce it? So we find that about 1/3 of this uncertainty can be reduced through simple technical clarifications of how renewable energy is accounted for in NDCs or about which historical emission inventory is used. The largest remaining uncertainties depend to a large extent on political choices about how NDCs are expressed, for example, as intensity improvements, and might hence turn out to be irreducible. This highlights that a thorough and robust process that keeps track of where emissions are heading today is of utmost importance for the global stocktake. This research will be published in an open access journal, so it's accessible to all.
Thank you very much. From EASA, we also have Mr. Volker Kreh.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm representing here the CD-Links project consortium, which is a large international consortium looking particularly at integrated solutions for both tackling climate change and sustainable development goals. In this assessment, which is still ongoing, we find evidence for both synergies as well as trade-offs between climate change mitigation, for example, and sustainable development goals. On the one hand, this is probably most well-known, climate change mitigation generally generates significant synergies with air quality improvements, thus reducing negative health impacts of air pollution. Another area where it's a bit more ambiguous is management of scarce water resources. Here we find that options are available to pursue stringent mitigation, climate mitigation without increasing water demand, for example, through adoption of water efficient cooling technologies in the power sector, but also by making the right choices about structural change in power generation and by managing or reducing energy demand overall. Then there are a few areas where we see potential risk of trade-offs or adverse impacts if we don't go with smart integrated climate policy solutions. For example, inclusive development and climate policies are key
to reduce the risk of hunger for simultaneous achievement of eradicating hunger, which is SDG 2, and the 2 or 1.5 degree targets. And likewise, such inclusive policies are also needed to combine emission reductions efforts and make them compatible with supporting, securing access to clean energy services, predominantly in developing countries, so that stringent climate protection, which generally leads to increasing energy prices, doesn't deteriorate access to clean, modern energy services. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cray. I'd now like to invite Mr. Tomohiro Hajima from Japan.
Thank you. I'm from Japan, working for a domestic project for climate change projection. Climate research program in Japan have been financially supported by the Ministry of Education and Culture, Sports, Science and Technology Japan, MEXT, which has been implementing the development of climate models, climate change projection, and creation of information to support the management of climate-related disaster risks by using the HPC system called Earth Simulator. As the previous project ended this March, MEXT has launched a new research program named Integrated Research Program for Advancing Climate Models. This poster is the introduction of the new project. In an area of the project shown as the blue panel in the poster, we will tackle scientific problems such as reducing the uncertainty of projection on future global warming and carbon budget, so-called TCRE, whose importance has increased after the entry into force of the Paris Agreement. For those purposes, we will further improve the Earth system models and utilize the models for other scientific issues. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Also from Japan, we have Mr. Shamil Maksyotov. You have the floor.
Thank you. Japan's greenhouse gas observing satellite, GOSAT, measures globally the column concentration of two major greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide and methane, from 2009. And to maintain data continuity, Japan will launch GOSAT's successor, GOSAT-2, in next fiscal year. So my main message is that we have shown that GOSAT data can be used to map the enhancement of greenhouse gas concentration due to anthropogenic emissions from large cities, industrial areas, and other emission sources. And such enhancement can be qualitatively compared to those derived from greenhouse gas emission inventories using atmospheric transport models. Moreover, the space-based greenhouse gas monitoring now includes, in addition to GOSAT, the United States OCO2 satellite and Chinese TANSAT, and it has a potential to become a new tool for independent and transparent verification of national greenhouse gas emission inventories. So we are willing to work together with scientists and inventory compilers from all countries to establish methodologies for such satellite data application in near future.
Thank you very much. I would now like to ask Mr. Tommi Ekholm from the VTT Technical Research Center of Finland.
Thank you. The study I present maps optimal emission pathways under a cost-benefit framework using a wide range of plausible assumptions on discount rate, future mitigation costs, uncertainty on climate sensitivity and climate damages. And in the results, with most of the calculated cases, the optimal emission pathways fall between corresponding 1.5 degree and 2 degree pathways up to year 2050. So the results thus suggest that the 1.5 to 2 degree target range of the Paris Agreement provides a really robust policy guidance for the next decade's mitigation action under a wide range of plausible parameter choices in the cost-benefit framework. The consideration of uncertainty, particularly if we assume that it won't be decreased over time through learning, warrants more precautionary action to combat climate change. And relating to the stocktake process, the resulting range of optimal emissions in 2030 is very wide in these cases, from 23 to 53 gigatons of CO2 equivalents with a median at 40 gigatons. And this range implies a notable emission gap relative to the party's current NDC targets. Thank you.
Finally, I'd like to invite my friend Amir Delju from WMO for his presentation.
Thank you very much, Carlos. Observation and data analysis provide reliable set of climate indicators that support global stocktake. Such indicators are based on the physical status of the atmosphere, oceans, and land, including cryosphere. By climate indicators, we can understand better the water, carbon, and energy budget, which gives us a representative picture of changes to the Earth system. Thank you.
Thank you, Amir. Nice and concise. Indeed, it seems that the IPCC AR6 will have a wealth of new information coming forth from the scientific community, and I think we'll all be better off for it. I'd now like to invite questions from the floor for the remainder of our dialogue, and questions can be to all experts, including our keynote presenters. I think I need a telescope. Yeah, you have the floor.
Yes.
It's Orville Gray of Jamaica.
Thank you, Chair, and it's good to see you here in the room, and welcome to everyone else. I'm speaking as the co-chair for the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage. And it's not so much a question, but more so a comment in terms of looking at the conversation with the WIM, with all the various technical bodies, the expertise that lies within the room that we have here and outside. And just to remind everyone that where the ExCom is concerned in terms of engagement with the research community, there are two mandates on the COP22 that serve us fairly well. The first one is the COP recommending for advanced work of the ExCom in terms of improving access to and interaction with relevant scientific and technical panels, bodies, and expertise that may be available to the WIM and its executive committee and substructures over time. And in this respect, looking at the scientific research organizations with expertise in science relevant to loss and damage to ensure that the best available science is highlighted in the work of the WIM. And secondly, the COP also invited United Nations and other relevant institutions, specialized agencies, entities, the research community, and the private sector as appropriate to strengthen cooperation and collaboration, including through partnerships with the executive committee on topics relevant to addressing loss and damage associated with the adverse effects of climate change, including extreme events and slow onset events. I bring this forward because based on the wealth of information that we've just received, it's quite clear that there are alternatives or avenues open to us in terms of engagement with the research community. It's quite clear that the work that we're doing, because in some cases, if you look at our mandate, if you look at our work program, you recognize that we are responsible for creating technical expert groups or committees that are looking at specific areas as it relates to loss and damage related to climate change. And in that respect, it is crucial that we have the best available science informing the work that we do. So the research community and their assistance in terms of collaborating with us will be absolutely vital in terms of getting that work done. I'd also want to highlight that where we are now as a WIM, we're looking at our strategic engagement going forward as we prepare our 5-year rolling work plan. which I'm sure you will hear about as we get to the COP. And in that respect, what the ExCom plans to do is, with a longer time horizon, we're looking at ways to enhance, in collaboration with relevant organizations, knowledge and understanding on the risk of climate change impacts, including those I mentioned before, extreme events and slow onset events. And having said that, there are various work streams under the WIM that will be able to facilitate the work that we're doing, and where the collaboration can be very important. And that also includes areas such as non-economic losses, comprehensive risk management approaches, migration, displacement, and human mobility, and also looking at ways in which we can enhance action and support. So it's abundantly clear, based on what we have seen and heard today in terms of what the research community is doing, it's abundantly clear that there is synergy with the work that the WIM is doing. And as such, collaboration with the ExCom is something that we look forward to and encourage from all the partners here to work with us so that we can address the issues and be fruitful on our mandates as presented to us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Orville, for that message from the WIM. Indeed, I will work my way up this way, so you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. IPCC reports have been very powerful tool to convince policymakers for decision making. Acknowledging IPCC, your valuable contribution and respecting the best available scientific information, we feel translating science into practice is still very challenging. Several new and emerging issues are ahead of us. The expectations with IPCC are increasing. In this context, we notice that in order to inform the global stocktake, the IPCC will be considering an assessment of the relation between adaptation needs and its limits and mitigation efforts. Many parties are calling for loss and damage to be included in the global stocktake. If it were to be included, would the IPCC be able to offer scientific information on this important topic? Thank you.
Thank you, Nepal. And indeed, I'll take the round of interventions and then turn it to the IPCC for a response. Is it Anne or Linda who wants the floor? You have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to thank the presenters for their excellent presentation. I have a comment and then a question to WCRP and Vimsky. The UNFCCC has clearly expressed the need for ongoing information on 1.5 degrees Celsius. Therefore, AR6 must enhance the IPCC's ability to inform UNFCCC in its review of the long-term temperature goal, and must provide relevant information for the global stocktake. We are pleased to see that a scenario for 1.5 degrees Celsius is included in CMIP6, the Climate Model Intercomparison Project that will feed into AR6. But given the significance of this scenario for the UNFCCC's work, could you please confirm that RCP 1.9 scenarios will be included in Tier 1 of CNIP6? We consider it of utmost importance that all modeling groups assess RCP 1.9 so that this can be adequately included in AR6.
Thank you very much, Belize, for that. I then have, is it Norway?
Thank you, Chair. This is Norway. I would like to thank all the presenters for a very, very informative session. I think it's very useful, and I'm very pleased to see that we now get more research on low emission scenarios, including 1.5 scenarios. I'm also pleased to hear that the IPCC 6th assessment report will focus on issues relevant for the global stocktake. And furthermore, I think it's very promising that it looks like the 6th assessment report also will put more emphasis on the issues related to how we can achieve these low emission scenarios and what kind of mitigation options we have and what policy instruments are available and so on. And it was, I mean, the figure Jim showed us about, the deep need for reductions and also to have negative emissions in the second half of the century is kind of creating a lot of questions from the governments about how this can be achieved. And I hope that we will get some good answers in the coming research and in the sixth assessment report. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Norway. I would now like to invite Germany. Take the floor.
Thank you, Chair. And thanks again to the presenters and those who provided the posters to us. And I think the poster session was indeed very interesting. And maybe this is also a reason why there are not so many questions in this room now, because we had already in-depth and direct exchange. So very useful. My question is to assess progress on mitigation, one can look at scenarios, and this is very important, and also at temperature and concentration pathways. But the direct effects of mitigation efforts will not be easy to detect in the atmosphere by observations, at least not in the near term in the coming decades, due to the internal variability of the climate system. However, decision makers at all levels still need to know what works and what works not. At least they need to act, and they need to act now or tomorrow, very soon. And therefore, the science, in our view, should also assess options and policy instruments for decarbonization in different sectors, and that in the near term, to provide insights in short-term entry points for climate policy, and also to provide information on the effects of decisions on infrastructure we take now, what they would like, the effects they would have in the long run. So 3 things we think regarding policy options and policy instruments, which should also be addressed by science. And so coordination by the World Climate Research Programme has greatly advanced physical science, but now obviously there is a need for social sciences. And I would like to know if there is also a similar internationally coordinated activity to establish knowledge on mitigation options, their potential co-benefits and their effectiveness. That would be indeed very useful. And I know that there's nothing comparable to WCRP, but this is also a plea maybe to establish something similar like to this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And indeed, I'm happy to hear that the poster session has proven valuable. Science leads to innovation, and we then implement here. The European Union?
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you a lot for all the presentations. I would have a question to Jim Ski as well, and which actually this issue has been a bit touched upon by Norway in his intervention. Most pathways to climate stabilization show that delayed climate action will increase dependence on negative emissions. AR5 considered bioenergy combined with carbon capture and storage or BECCS as the principal mean for getting negative emissions. However, slower than expected technological development, costs and land use issues have brought the availability of BECCS at necessary scale into question. In upcoming IPCC products, are you planning to address other negative emission technologies than BECCS? And do you think that is there enough scientific information available today to do this in a reasonable and authoritative way? Thank you.
Thank you for the questions, EU. Finally, Estonia.
Thank you, Chair, for giving me the floor, and thank you for all speakers for the very interesting presentations. My question is to Jim Ski. I'm wondering how much attention will the IPCC Working Group 3 give to the social and institutional transformation that has to enable the transition to the low-carbon economy? Thank you.
Thank you very much for the questions. Jim, are you going to answer all the questions from the IPCC? And then we'll think about who does the social science?
I got quite a number of questions there, not all of which are actually for Working Group 3. If I can just say on the loss and damage side, which is much more on the Working Group 2 and the impacts adaptation end of it, and we do have Working Group 2 colleagues in the room, these issues were addressed indirectly when we were scoping the climate change and land report and the oceans report in terms of limits to adaptation and residual impact. So these were the kind of the scientific ways through, I think, to address the kind of the loss and damage issues. And again, on RCP 1.9, whether it's in CMIP 6, I have to say I have no authority whatsoever to answer that question, because IPCC does not do its own scenarios, and the climate scenarios are actually part of Working Group 1. So I have to confess I don't know, but I do know that colleagues in the Working Group 3 domain are actively working on socioeconomic scenarios associated with reduced climate models that would be compatible with that kind of concentration. So it will absolutely be in scope. I think on the points from Germany about policy, I didn't go into it, but there are 2 chapters that were in the Working Group 3 outline, which are about policies and institutions at the national and subnational level, where I think there is an aspiration to look much more at what works in terms of policies, and more than Working Group 3 has done in the past, to include case studies that would provide evidence and examples of positive outcomes, rather than simply abstract discussions of theories. Of policy intervention. So that is there, and the social and infrastructure elements, if you dive into the bullet points that underlie each of the chapters, they're really covered quite copiously, actually in terms of when you go down to the detail. On the point on bio-CCS or BECS, indeed, one of the reasons that we were stimulated to put together the expert meeting on mitigation, sustainability and climate stabilization scenarios was because of the reactions to some of the conclusions from the AR5 report, particularly on bioenergy with CCS. So it is mentioned in several different places in the report. Bio-CCS will be covered partly in the energy chapter, where we would sort of measure bioenergy in terms of exajoules, and it will also be covered in the AFALU chapter, where you would be looking at the implications of bioenergy exploitation in terms of the hectares of land and the potential competition with food. It's also covered in one of the other chapters that's enigmatically entitled Mitigation Options Beyond and Across Sectors, which covers some of the other elements as well. And finally, in terms of social transformation, that would be covered in some of the policy chapters, but actually in the chapter 3 I mentioned on long-term transformation, a sort of a more innovative element is not just to look at quantitative results from the integrated assessment models, but also to include the coverage of literature in terms of socio-technical transitions as well, to combine it with that more qualitative work. So if you look down into the detail, and obviously they're not, that's not all published yet, you'll see that many of the elements that people have mentioned just in the last 3, 4, 5 interventions are actually covered in the detailed bullets.
Thank you very much, Jim. Is there anyone else from the IPCC that can supplement? Jim's? Yes, you have the floor.
Deborah Roberts, co-chair of Working Group 2. I just wanted to pick up on the loss and damage issue, because Jim has already referred to the fact that that issue was surfaced during the scoping of the Land and Ocean and Cryosphere report. But last week we were in Addis for the 4-week scoping out the main assessment report, and just looking at the proposed Working Group 2 outline. So just as Jim cautioned, we have an outline, but it's merely proposed until it's approved and debated in September by the panel. But looking at that, loss and damage is touched on through reference to residual risks, which appear in both the regional outline points, context points, and in Chapter 16 on key risks. We've got references to loss in Chapter 8 on poverty, livelihoods, and economic development, and in Chapter 17 on decision-making and options. And we also have references to limits to natural adaptation in Chapter 3 on oceans, Chapter 5 on food, fiber, and other services from managed ecosystems, and also in terms of the regional context bullet points and Chapter 16 on key risks. So you can see that there's fairly extensive coverage of this issue in the proposed outline. So I think probably a higher profile than this issue has had before.
Thank you very much, colleagues. I would really like to continue this dialogue, but time has run out and I need to rush off to another meeting. So let me thank you for this open and valuable exchange of views and for your interest in the research dialogue. We listened to a wealth of information from the science community. Today's event has demonstrated that the research dialogue is an important vehicle to enhance the communication between the science community and parties, and to disseminate scientific information that is important to policymakers on a broad range of issues under discussion in our process. At the same time, the dialogue also provides a unique opportunity for the parties to consider conclusions so as to inform the scientific community of what research needs and priorities are, so as to base our decision-making and process on scientifically sound information. The posters, presentations, and discussions have also highlighted that despite the marked differences between regions, we all share challenges to respond to climate change, and there is an opportunity to learn from others to optimize scientific knowledge sharing and capacity. I thank again all the experts for their cooperation and participation in our process, and thank parties for dynamically engaging in this dialogue to the benefit of the whole UNFCCC process and the Paris Agreement. I invite parties to consider all information under the two themes covered today as they continue to deliberate on conclusions under the RSO agenda item. I will provide a report on the outcome of this dialogue and post it on the website before Substa 47. The posters will remain on display in the foyer outside until Saturday afternoon, and we're actually working to see if we can keep it up until the close of the SBs next week, Thursday. Is David still around? Well, let me inform the dialogue that David Carlson is retiring in June, and I wanted to thank him for his valuable contribution to our research dialogue meetings over the last few years and to the Earth Information Day at COP22 in Marrakesh last year. He helped to bring science to Substa and report the Substa wishes back to the community. We are sad to see that he's going, but we wish him well in his retirement. And could we please give him a round of applause in his absence? Thank you very much, and I adjourn this meeting.